this takes us into, and again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but it takes us into one of the most controversial aspects of this story, which is the so-called binary code message, where he'd written things like speed, impossible, because this thing was on the ground for, 10, 15 minutes. And this was a small clearing in the forest where apparently it had smashed some branches to come. But apparently it translates to continuous exploration for planetary advance. People knew the incident had happened because the story actually made the front page of a British tabloid newspaper in 1983.
A few years later.
Yes. But again, remember that this is before the internet, and the old saying, today's newspaper is tomorrow's fish and chip paper.
Right.
It's a British saying, but
I've heard that one before.
Yeah. So yes, there was some knowledge that this incident had taken place. There'd been this newspaper story, some follow-up stories, a couple of books written about it, but a lot of the information was pretty wide of the mark. And so Jim Penniston talked about touching the side of this thing, getting almost I hate to use this phrase, but I'm going to use it, telepathic download. Because this takes us into, and again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but it takes us into one of the most controversial aspects of this story, which is the so-called binary code message that subsequently came out.
The zeros and ones.
The zeros and ones.
Can you explain that? This is wild.
Years after all this, years, in about 2010, Jim Penniston was taking part in a TV program that was recreating this incident. And he had his original police notebook there in which he had sketched the symbols that he'd seen on the side of the craft. Because his testimony is that he'd taken photos, but after he shot off the whole roll of film, he thought as a fallback he would go back to old-fashioned methods and start making some sketches and notes. Good job he did, because the base processing laboratory later told him those photos didn't come out properly. Now,
that's convenient.
Yeah, one theory is that that's true, and that is a byproduct of radiation at the site. And I want to come on to radiation later because it's the single most important piece of physical evidence that we have. So far I've talked about eyewitness testimony, but I'm going to come on to talk about physical evidence. But it may be that it was a cover story, and that the actual pictures of this craft exist in a file in a basement office somewhere in the intelligence community. I don't know. I don't know that. So,
guys, if you'd like to check out Nick's book on Rendlesham, Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, you can do so by hitting the link to our Amazon store below. You will find his book right there, along with a bunch of other books and films of guests that have been on the podcast that is now live, so check out that link in the description. Also, if you haven't checked them out already, our Discord and Patreon links are in the description. We are starting to do AMAs on Discord, and we are also now releasing a new show called The Julian and Alessi Show with my producer, Alessi Alaman, on Patreon, along with some other exclusive content from episodes that we have been putting out on YouTube that are not seen on YouTube.
So anyway, Jim was leafing through the notebook where he'd written things like speed, impossible, because this thing was on the ground for, 10, 15 minutes. And this was a small clearing in the forest where apparently it had smashed some branches to come in through the canopy. And then it took off vertically, very slowly, cleared the treetops, and then shot away at high speed.
He had touched it.
After he touched it.
After he touched it. So nothing happened when he touched it. Other than his own effect.
His own effect. No, nothing happened. Well, no, I think it did change in brightness. But I'm doing this from memory in a situation where I haven't looked at his testimony for some time. I can't remember whether he described the hull as being hot, cold, or neutral to the touch. I can't remember whether he said that changed when he touched it or not, and I can't recall whether, although I think he said that something changed physically as well as getting this, but I can't swear to it.
Okay.
So, I don't want to guess it. So, yeah. Anyway, it shot off at high speed. He wrote in his book, Speed Impossible.
And how did it rise up like anti-gravity? And then,
well, I don't want to say anti-gravity because we have vertical takeoff and landing technology. It could just be like a Harrier jump jet, except there was no sound.
No sound.
So that is interesting because normally where you have these vertical takeoff, there's a huge sound, a roar of the engines. So again, indicative possibly of an exotic, radically different propulsion system.
And you said there were 3 verifiable witnesses, though. There was, what's this guy's name again?
This guy is Jim Penniston.
Jim Penniston, and then there were 2 others.
John Burroughs, who was a little further back and talks about this in terms of intense light that he couldn't see past. So he didn't see the craft. And then Ed Kavanasak, who was even further back and was so spooked by some of this that he's only ever gone on the record a couple of times very briefly. So we don't have much testimony from him at all. Afterwards, a lot of them were told to write statements. He did later say, Kavanasak said, look, I didn't even read my statement. They typed something up, put it in front of me, I signed it. He said, I just wanted to get out of there.
That's interesting.
Anyway, so the story of this binary code is that Jim Penniston, for this TV interview, was going to talk about the symbols. And somebody just walking past him and looking over his shoulder before the interview said, "What's that?" And there were like 16 pages of ones and zeros. And Jim looked a bit embarrassed and said, "Oh, that's I don't really know." And they had to kind of tease the story out of him. And the story was that he got this kind of download when he touched the side of the thing, and that 2 or 3 days later at home, he got a sudden compulsion to get out this book, and he just wrote 16 pages of ones and zeros, was then almost too embarrassed about it and or forgot about it and didn't say anything for another few
30,
decades. Yeah. And bear in mind,
was it translatable in any way?
Yes, it was, although I want to come on to that. I just want to make one other point about Jim. Jim stayed in the service. So it kind of became okay to talk a little bit about the UFO because as I'll go on to say, I've only talked so far about the first of 3 nights of activity. On one of the later nights, the deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, himself became a witness and kind of got dragged into the public domain on this. So Jim was kind of okay with talking about it because it's like, hey, well, my colonel, he saw it too on a different night, not landed, but look, if the deputy base commander saw it and is talking about it, it's kind of okay for me to talk about that. But he knew it was not going to be okay to talk about telepathic downloads. So he just either kept quiet or blocked it or both.
So he thought, that's interesting though, because the whole thing, especially back then, would have sounded preposterous to anyone, but he was still separating out like, well, that I could talk about, but this I can't.
Yeah.
He still put a grade on it.
You can talk about the UFO because you got that top cover from Colonel Holt.
Fair, okay.
But ones and zeros, no. It sounded crazy then. Arguably, it sounds crazy now. Sure. It does have, apparently, a translation. The TV production company found a computer engineer, computer scientist who did the sort of whatever that code is, the what is it, the ASCII, whatever it is. But anyway, binary to basically to normal language. And apparently, and I'm doing this from memory, So I may get
See if you
this.
can pull it up, Alessi.
Yeah, it's out there on the net. But apparently it translates to continuous exploration for planetary advance, eyes of our eyes, origin year 8100. And there then follow a series of latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates.
Wait a second.
Yeah, I know.
Is this like a future human implication?
Yes, it is.
Oh my God.